I'm so delighted and excited and happy to be with you all this morning. As Pastor Rick mentioned, my name is Kay or Katie Ruth. I'm the current executive director at Pennsylvania Interfaith Power Light. So as you heard a little bit from Rick, I'm working with congregations and people of faith all across the big state of Pennsylvania, which I have learned a lot in the past 2 years about just how big our state is. I do everything, and we do everything, my team and I together, everything from hosting environmental education programs, advocating for safe and just climate policy, and taking action through direct conservation projects as well. I actually came to visit your community earlier this year to see the beautiful solar panels that got installed, and so want to send my congratulations and regards to this community for taking bold and loving and faithful action to care for this world that is our common home to share. So thank you. It was such a delight to learn about the project and how it all came together for you all, so thank you. After church today, I'll take a little bit more time to kind of dig into what we are doing over at PEIPL, how you can get involved and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to save all that good part for later, so hopefully you're going to stick around. But for now, I want to transition us into a time of just sharing and reflecting on what we've read and the words that I have prepared for you today. I do have to share a little bit of a word of warning, though. I grew up in the Baptist tradition, and so there are 3 things that are true about our preaching, at least I find. We preach long, we're always alliterating, and we outline in 3s. I would have said there's always food after church, but then I would have been out of the bounds of my 3, so I will do my best to keep us short and get us out of here on time, but old habits, they kind of die hard. My preaching practice that has kind of grown beyond my raising within the Baptist tradition is to really look for the forgotten and the silenced voices in a text whenever I'm thinking about preaching it. I also am committed to bringing a queer and ecofeminist perspective to the texts that I read, and also not just to the text, but the questions that we ask about them. My hope is that in you all getting to hear a little bit how I interpret and hear these texts in my experience and from my perspective, that will also prompt something for your own reflection, and that together we can create new kinds of imaginations for what lessons might be found in these texts that we all know and love so well. So, trees. I see we have a beautiful tree down here, even on your altar. I love trees. Trees, and specifically, or more specifically, branches and vines, are the main focus of the text that we just read from John's Gospel. Trees show up a lot in our sacred texts. In fact, they show up more frequently in the Christian Bible than everything else, with the exception of people and God. That's a lot of mentions, and it's worth our attention. It gives us important geographical, sociological, and I believe theological data. We also know that trees show up in many other religious traditions, and this reminds us of their universality as a portal for considering our connection to the divine. In the Islamic tradition, there's a hadith that instructs the hearer to plant a sapling, even if the last day approaches. There is an entire Jewish holiday that's devoted to the celebration of trees. Hinduism considers trees especially sacred. Underneath a Bodhi tree, the Buddha gains enlightenment. In Baha'i teachings, the tree frequently represents divine revelation. Tree groves are important in pagan practice and community, and many indigenous communities also practice earth-centric rituals that include and honor the lives of trees. Sikhs around the world plant trees to honor Guru Nanak, who spoke about respecting earth as mother. That's just a little small sampling, but hopefully you can start to see this big picture that trees have a really important role in our spiritual traditions and our faith practices that I think is worth paying attention to. For me, I grew up on Gadigal lands, which are the lands that are commonly known as Sydney, Australia, on the banks of a very muddy river known as the Tarrenburra. So for me, my worldview as a little kid was shaped by these scurrying crabs and sparkling waters and these big scaling cliffs that kind of hug the river as it makes its way down to the bay. Each of these different creatures holds a sacred place in my childhood memory. And there was also, of course, many different trees. I grew up with jacaranda trees and frangipani trees, mulberry trees, and also mangrove trees. As an adult, I've begun to learn a lot more about these special trees that have special significance from my childhood. And those have furthered my imagination as I think about the work that I do with Pennsylvania Interfaith Power Light as a community organizer and as a spiritual person who cares about the world in which we live. So I want to talk to you about mangroves for a second. Has anyone ever seen a mangrove tree before? Awesome. They're actually not very common in the US. There's actually only 3 species of mangrove found in the US, and they're all found way down in the south, like Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. So they are a little bit more of a tropical tree, but I'm going to tell you a little about them. They are these really, if you haven't seen them, unusual looking trees, and one of their key distinct features is they have these big aerial roots that grow up out of the water, and the structural roots kind of provide this incredible structure and also a breathing system that keeps the trees sustained and alive. That unique kind of feature of the tree is actually what helps it to survive within its particular context, which is kind of in the muddy riverbanks right along the river. And they provide wonderful, wonderful things to help support the environment in which they live. I mentioned that there's 3 types of tree here in the US, but there's actually 41 species of mangrove tree that are found in Australia. 41. And that actually represents more than half of the world's mangrove species that we know about. So more than half of the world's mangrove species are found actually in Australia. And they contribute many environmental benefits, including things like stabilizing soil. They provide a buffer zone and a lot of habitat for critters. And they also are a food source for both animals and humans. I want to focus in a little bit on the wood itself, though, too, because mangrove timber is traditionally used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders for canoes and paddles and also weaponry. And so I want to tell the story of the mangroves to invite us to our first lesson for reflection today, which is this: structure is power. Jesus shares a metaphor of a vine, fruit, and branches in today's gospel. In this story, God is the gardener. Jesus is a vine that grows up from the soil, and those who follow the teachings of Jesus, well, they're the branches. Love is the fruit of this creative process of tending, rooting, and fruiting. It is the communal nature of shared relationship and resources that results in the blooming, is what we read in the text. Water, soil, and sunlight are all necessary components that we know. They're not mentioned in the text, but we know that that's how trees grow. Just like the aerial root structure of mangroves helps support its thriving in its very unique environment, the structure that Jesus articulates for us here is really important. It provides us with a model that reminds us that we don't love alone. Love is an inherently communal and relational act, and it is loving in community that provides the strong power and structure that we need to survive. When we practice love in the context and in the power of loving community, its power only continues to grow. As a child, I experienced deep spiritual connection when I was among the trees. Without being told it, I recognized I was in an interdependent relationship with them. I discerned that our breath was shared, our water was one, and our destinies intertwined. I still actually love to visit with the mangroves when I go home, and I just came back from a trip earlier this summer, and so I'm fresh off of touching and spending time with my beloved mangroves. Along that little bend of the river where I spent my childhood, there's an intimate remembering, I think, that happens whenever I go back there. They remember me, I remember them, we sit together. I swear they are some of the wisest beings on this planet that I know. And so, fresh off of that experience, I've been thinking a lot about how this second lesson that I believe is in the text for us, strong is relational, is mirrored in both my relationship with the mangroves, and I think is an important teaching in today's text. Yvonne Gabarra is an ecofeminist liberation theologian, and she wrote a book called Longing for Running Waters, which if you haven't read it, I highly encourage you to take a look at it, maybe use it for a book club or something. Gabarra, in her book, she lays out a framework that undergirds her thinking, and she makes the argument that God can be defined as relationship. Relational presence shapes the entirety of our lives, from our first breath to our last, from the smallest atom to the biggest star. It links everything to everyone. Relationship and the practice of it takes us out of the realm of abstract, this concept or thing, into the personal, the practicing, and the practical. And so Gabarra shares the following about her framework. This is a bit of a lengthy passage, but hopefully if you listen closely, you'll catch what she's saying and find it valuable. So Gabarra says, to call God relatedness is to use a word to express something that goes beyond all words. It describes an experience, but it goes beyond experience. It speaks of God as possibility, opening, unexpected, unknown, as physical and metaphysical. This is a relatedness that has no exact definition. It is not reduced to a given being, given species, or even given system. It is not relatedness in itself or separate from the fullness that exists. Rather, Gabarra notes, it is a relatedness as continual presence that is made explicit in different ways in different beings. This relatedness of beings, not in itself or for itself, that is not its thing. In describing relatedness this way, we are trying to say that it seems to be the only way, limited as it surely is, to grasp this reality, to both express it and then to live it out. It is a multitude relatedness encountered in variety of expression. So, put in simple terms, I think what Gabarra is trying to share here is that there is not one way to be in relationship or no relatedness, but there is a multiplicity of relatedness that is true of the world in which we live. And so, for Gabarra and for me, this knowledge of a multi-relational and a multi-relational God and a multi-relating world invites us to radically reshape the way that we fruit in love. Good fruit meets needs. It isn't just for aesthetics. We all have taken a bite into an apple and been sorely disappointed, right? Good fruit provides sustenance, nutrition, and even medicine. Poisonous fruit offers little comfort to the hungry. Bell Hooks, who is an author known for her writing around race, class, and feminism, and one of my personal favorite authors, shares the following about relational approaches to community. When we love the earth, we are able to love ourselves more fully. I believe this because the ancestors told me it was so. For me, her words powerfully encapsulate the relational rhythms that Gabarra is trying to attune our attention towards, ones for me that I learned from wise old mangroves. Relationality is at the heart of responding to the challenges of our time. When we recognize that our liberation is bound up together, we begin to experience true freedom. We cannot love what we do not know. In 2015, nearly 40 million mangrove trees died along a 2,000 remote stretch of Australia due to extremely dry weather. Scientists understand this unusual occurrence to be a result of climate change. This expiration released more than 1 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere. As temperatures continue to rise and our coastline wetland systems become compromised, we will continue to witness devastating losses like this, and so much more. It makes me sad to think about the riverbanks I grew up on becoming bare, lifeless, devoid of the artful austerity of these beautiful old mangrove trees. When I think about all that we are poised to lose, along with the magnitude of the suffering of those who are, for the most part, least responsible, I don't know about you, but I begin to feel a little bit overwhelmed. It feels impossible to know how to make a difference, where to get engaged, how do we solve suffering, how do we avoid moral injury, living in this world in which suffering and the news cycle and everything that's happening around us just seems to be so dreary, so less full of life and hope than what we want to see. For me, I don't want this to be the story that we write about ourselves, that we are hopeless or without a vision of a future for who we could be. I don't want that to be the story of collective us. Relationality, I believe, requires our grief, but also refuses a hopeless abandon. This brings me to our final lesson from the branches and the vines today. Small is all. Small is all is one of the principles of emergent strategy as conceived by Adrienne Marie Brown. Brown is an activist, facilitator, and writer who explores a lot, and I've learned a lot from, in how to build effective movements for change in our world. When I think about paying attention to the small, to the minute, to the things that we often look over, I think about this common phrase, perhaps you've heard it: if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? While a great question to get the party started at a dinner party, or if you're talking with friends and the conversation runs a little dry, for me as a theologian, I want to take this question and run with it, because that's what we do. And so for me, this assumption that there is nothing when no one is present, or sound only has a meaning when someone hears it, is a misconception in and of itself, because forests are complex ecosystems. In reality, the falling of a tree in a forest presents an entire new orchestra of sound that reverberates through the universe, much of it imperceptible to our human ears. Perhaps a reminder that the small matters. We must pay attention to the small, even as we learn to see the whole picture, because the large is always a reflection of the small. Change begins in seed. Our sacred texts actually constantly remind us of the importance of small too. Not one bird falls to the ground unseen. One small lunch becomes a feast. The few coins hold more value than the big, inauthentic offering. Water offered to the stranger has reward. Little children matter in God's economy. Indeed, God has chosen the small things of this world. We are instructed to love all of creation. If God loves all, God creates, then how we relate to God's creation is ultimately how we relate to God. Love defines its terms through solidarity, not hierarchy. Practicing love in the smallest iteration creates rippling realities of scale from which new futures become possible. There is a saying, can't see the forest for the trees, but perhaps it is only by seeing and knowing each of the individual trees in a forest that we get to know its beauty. In a similar way, when we pay attention to the fruit that our branches are bearing, to bring us back to today's gospel, we get to know ourselves, God, and the world around us from the smallest iteration up. We are invited to become disciples of the small, to discern the wisdom that comes from the small things. There is an important and compassionate theological position with which we must pair today's teachings about love and how far and wide and beautiful it can grow. That all of this love that is grounding us in our faith and practice doesn't negate our experience of living in a painful world. As humans, we often prefer to skip to the good part, right? We want to celebrate the victory. We don't want to sit in our pain. Whether it is genocide, greed, or the gradual climate collapse that I've been talking about this morning, for me at least, it is my first inclination to reach for hope, for Band-Aid, for an assurance that things are going to turn out okay. But I think that the deeper wisdom that we're invited to sit with this morning is that love doesn't actually require us to just hold on to a this false positivity. We are invited to journey with love, allowing us to sit in her tender embrace with our grief and everything else in between. The love of which I've been speaking this morning is a love that's big enough to hold our anger and our rage and our disappointment and our sadness. It's enough to fill every tiny crack in our heart that only we know about. That kind of love invites our hope to transition from something we claim, this abstract thing out there, to something that we practice together in community. The refusal of apathy to choose to love anyway is the practice of hope to which we are called. So, if this is the love of which we speak, and this is the invitation that we have, how then do we live? For me, the answer is simple and yet profound. We must love as if the whole world depends on it, as if the very existence of sacredness itself depends on it. It was through living connection with trees that I learned firsthand the lessons that I've shared with you today. In climbing their strong bodies, I learned the importance of structural integrity and what it means to place trust into community beyond myself. In breathing in the world of the mangroves, I learned about the importance and power of relationship as these trees live together, meeting their needs and having them met. In exploring the wide ecosystem that is our beautiful world, I have learned about the intricate complexities of the small things that make up our big giant world. So, beloveds, may we stand strong and whimsical, just like mangroves. May we seek to lean into the murmurations of our creaturely relatedness. May we practice a discipleship of the small things. And may love hold and transform us in the doing. May it be so.